Thank you very much. Well, delighted to be here. I know some of you. I think I shared a very bumpy flight with a few of you from Montreal last night, but nothing to compare with Lee Parker's famous journey. Yeah, it's a real thrill. Actually, the last time I shared a platform or talked in the same room as Mats Alvesson, there was an earthquake. Do you remember that? And all the Americans dived under the table. We, of course, didn't know what was going on. We thought it was the pipe work or something. But out of that workshop came the first volume of critical management studies as well. So, yeah, I thought I would mention that. It's kind of interesting seeing all those books and seeing Matt's books and mine, because actually books are a genre where you can be a little bit freer and experiment more and try all the things that Mats was suggesting. But of course, we're a bit down on books culturally in academia at the moment, which I greatly regret. But certainly the book form is one that I've enjoyed as a way of, if you like, experimenting and writing prolegomenas to ideas and so on. So I think there are different genres whereby you can feel a little more free. Anyway, today, I've never presented this before. I wanted to share with you just some ideas and thoughts that have been bothering me for a few years, ever since Gendron and I wrote that thing about methodological approaches in the auditing journal. And I've been thinking about it since then. I've discussed with Eve over email. So I've put together some ideas, and I'm just not sure. I was working on these slides last week, so I can assure you it will be fresh, and I hope it will be useful. It's a slightly provocative title, or if David Cooper was here, he'd say it was a really annoying title, but it's very much personal. And you know, I stand here before you, whatever Marion has said, I think I'm still emerging as a scholar, just like you. I know it's easy for me to say that, but it's an unending quest, you know, things that have not been worked out. The problem is I'm running out of time. You've got a bit more time than me. But I think emergence is, it's a really nice title for this workshop, because I think it's a permanent condition of what we are or should be, rather than the kind of stasis that Mats was pointing to. So the Audit Society was published in 1997, and quite frankly, in my own mind, it's not finished yet. So that's the kind of sort of personal kind of relationship with work, which I think is kind of healthy, but you need to be very robust to deal with the idea that there's just so much to do. So in terms of the talk, I want to talk about constructivism. It's probably a word you've heard about a lot, and I'm going to focus in on sort of what I think the kind of general themes are in constructivism, but it's essentially an interest in how practices and people are made or co-made, broadly speaking. More of a process focus without presuming the kind of outcomes which seem to grab our attention, the stability that grabs our attention. And indeed, an important methodological principle is to study things that fall apart and fail. Failed accounting standards, failed organizations are quite interesting for revealing the formation or non-formation of practices. So I want to try and kind of appeal to the kind of constructivist spirit, or kind of bring out the constructivist spirit or mindset in your research, not in mine or anyone else's, but actually to activate some thoughts about your research, which Mats has already done. And if we have time, I want to say something just a little bit about writing and readability, although I think that's probably more appropriate for the editor's session that we have later. But it's been on my mind, and it is kind of related to the theme. So how to be a good constructivist? Well, I've highlighted in red the word be there. Before we get on to constructivism, what is being for us as academics? I mean, it's not identical with publishing or strategy or career tracks. It's something to do with this quality of emerging and continually emerging as a scholar because you're on a journey. Now, clearly we have to have careers and be pragmatic in all those kinds of things, but also to develop your own distinctive personal way of looking at the world of accounting, of practices and people, and sort of defining an intellectual identity for yourself. I once heard a very prominent economist say to me that when they started to study economics at the age of 18, she said that she knew exactly that that's what she wanted to do because that's how she thought already. There was a kind of recognition of being an economist. Now that might horrify you, but it was a very, very genuine symbiosis. And then of course, agency theory, I mean my department is full of people who do agency theory. It's not just a theory, it's a way that they look at the world. Agency relationships for agency theorists are ubiquitous. So it's not just a tool, although they might say it was, but it's a mode of thought. So I'm not saying whether that's a good or a bad thing, but as academics we kind of grow into a series of sensibilities, not a kind of thing that's boxed in, but a set of sensibilities about the world. And I think you heard Matt's kind of set of sensibilities earlier on, which was so interesting. And I'll say it in advance, I mean, what I mean by constructivism is not the kind of stale oppositions, you know, are you a constructivist or a positive or a positivist or so on. It's kind of much more important than that. In fact, what I'm going to say, it's a very, very empirical enterprise. Paul Vane, Foucault's colleague and friend, described Foucault himself as a good positivist, which is probably something we wouldn't necessarily think of in that vein. And we might think about what he meant by that. But in terms of accounting, I guess the person who was most, in my view, I mean there are many, but most naturally a constructivist was Anthony Hopwood. Before it became very kind of self-conscious, it's actually embodied in the way he writes. And that is why some of his classic papers, which I strongly recommend that you read, because there aren't that many of them, some of those classic papers are quite difficult to read. Because if you really believe in the kind of endogeneity of everything, then and codependence, then that creates a writing issue, which he always struggled with. So a very good example of that would be Volume 1, Number 1 of the European Accounting Review, where Anthony has, I think, a very interesting paper. And of course, these efforts at being a kind of natural constructivist built into the very style of writing, it's really not easy. It's really not easy. It's an unending quest, but I think it's worth making the journey. But to overcome that, we have to deal with a couple of issues, one of which Mats has already touched on, one of which I call the supermarket problem. And I think as younger scholars, I'm very sympathetic because you arrive in a world with a bewildering choice, the reading list to end all reading lists. And how do you choose? You know, how do you find direction? The supervisor is obviously a very important influence, and I mean, it's natural that mentorship relationship will influence the kinds of things you read. Here's just a little sample, and the bad news is I think you should read all these books and a lot more. I think you should read a lot. That's my advice to emerging scholars. Not only the key accounting studies, but all the dead people and the people who are still alive, and just read them. But the choice, I really sympathize because it takes a long time and the choice is bewildering. And this way of grasping things or entering into the sort of worlds of theorizing is actually not solved by the typical way of dealing with it, which is the methodology course, where you deal with one of these people a week and there's some kind of progression. I think it's much better to engage in reading groups, intense reading groups, if you can find just a few like-minded people, and read one of these things together and agonize about what they mean, what they might mean, and so on. So PhD students at LSE, we read Latour's Reassembling the Social, which made everyone very angry. We read that together. We also read Garfinkel's studies of ethnomethodology, which everyone, including me, found very confusing. But the experience of reading, close reading of some of these texts, I think, is a lasting one early on in your careers. So the trouble with the supermarket problem, it ignores what actually a lot of these thinkers have in common, the common things that they were wrestling with, but they're separated by differences in language and concepts and categories, which are very, very hard for people like us to kind of penetrate. So I'm going to try and give you a kind of meta template, if you like, for being able to position some of these people. The second problem, which Mats has also alluded to very nicely, is what I call the problem of theory. And I can only repeat what he said, but I've got kind of two models in my mind. One is the cement model, and the other is the kind of stepladder metaphor. And I'm sorry, I mean, it's a little bit crude. I think the cement model is more common than we think. I can see bits of cement in my own work and bits of inherited theory. One of the things I worry about a lot is the use of the word lens or perspective, which I think nearly everyone in this room is dealing with. I see it in many papers. It's a very innocent term. I'm looking at something through this lens or this perspective. And the real issue is whether really anything can change. If you have a lens, can anything change in what you're seeing? Does anything develop? That, of course, is a metaphor as well. But the real issue, which Mats spoke to, is whether the data is really in dialogue of some kind, whether you put your data in dialogue with whatever theory you're choosing, whether you use the theory as a kind of stepladder to say what you want to say with a kind of a lighter touch. And it's not easy. It's not easy. You have to start somewhere, and it takes a lot of confidence. But I would sort of urge on you to have the ambition to kind of try and make sure you're not adopting the cement model. When I read papers, very often I see fantastic glimmers when the authors start to think for themselves and start to kind of engage with the theory and the data. The trouble is that usually happens in the conclusion. It's not part of the entire enterprise. So what are the first steps here? I mean, this is a kind of diagnosis. What are the first steps in a practical sense? I think we should try this. Try and put things in your own words. Now, I'm not pretending for an instance this is easy. I mean, it's very difficult to put Habermas, for example, into your own words, because when you study Habermas, you almost have to become like him and write like him. And so there's a kind of osmosis going on there. But you have to kind of try and extract yourself. So, as I've said, I read a lot of papers where, as authors lighten up and try and put things in their own words, the exciting things that Mats was talking about, those insights start to happen. So when my own PhD students are struggling with kind of reference points, it's usually when they take too much for granted. I asked one of them to write in her own words what she thought Foucauldian people meant by the term problematization. And then I realized I didn't really know either. And so actually that task of taking these conventional reference points and kind of unpacking them over a cup of coffee and thinking about what would I say about this in my own words. Institutional logic, it's sort of built into the fabric of the way we think. But what's a logic? What actually is a logic, and what is it that makes it institutional? Sometimes all our social science concepts are continuous with natural language. They have strong metaphorical content. They're continuous with natural language. why not try and go back to the natural language and do it in your own words? And that's kind of hard, but it's really exciting to do. I've seen people gain a lot of confidence from being able to do that kind of translation issue. So that's one way, I think, of trying to deal with this bewildering array of theory and developing your own voice, is to try and deal with certain theoretical precepts in your own words and build up your own vernacular and your own way of doing it. So what about constructivism? It's a term that worries people a lot, and I haven't really talked about it yet. I think I would say, if you think you know what it is, you probably don't, because I sort of think I know what it is, but by Sunday evening I don't anymore. So it's a kind of, this is the emerging point. There's some sort of theoretical commitments which you're just constantly working with. So Marion asked me in the car last night whether I was a Foucauldian, and I just thought, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I am. Maybe I was on Sunday. But I don't know all the things that implies. So that's part of it. But to give us somewhere to start, to give us a stepladder, I want to kind of share with you what I think might be the constructivist essentials. And of course there's an irony in this, because the fourth essential point is that there are no essentials, but we'll come back to that. So the four essentials, three of them I'm going to talk about mainly, is the whole notion of relationality and relational entities. Most of you in this room, I think, implicitly or explicitly, are dealing with relations of some sort which are arranged in some kind of entity which is not yet visible to you. And indeed, as Matt's told us this morning, you, as the analyst, in making that relational entity visible, are kind of creating social facts. You're not just reflecting the world, you're creating social facts which may have a kind of critical relation to the world as it is. So making those relations and relational entities visible is the job of the constructivist analyst. The second theme is the old chestnut of agency and actions and actors, and how those actors are linked together and how they're shaped. And the third is the dynamic relation between the two of those. You have actors positioned in sets of relations, perhaps with material objects and texts and so on. What is that dynamic relationship? And that's the hardest thing to really get to grips with as an analyst. But nevertheless, there are some good studies around which do that. And then finally, there's no general theory of what is constructing what. In other words, this template is actually a template for empirical research. And then finally, I'll say something a little bit about constructivism and critique, because this is a critical perspectives event. So I think it's incumbent on me to say what I think might be the relationships. So, in terms of relationality, it's a question for all of you, really. A question for you to ask yourself is, do you as individuals naturally see relations and codependence in the things you study? Is that what speaks to you? Or do you see isolated, autonomous individuals making decisions, affecting other people, the kind of leadership myths that we heard about earlier? So does your research and your interest involve some kind of relations which are not yet visible, which you want to make visible, between people, things, and words? And is your question broadly, could it kind of take the generic form of how has the practice of X been formed or sustained or changed in this system of relations? And perhaps the most kind of important thing is, what kind of relational entities, what kind of ontologies of relations exist in your research field. We have lots of examples of relational entities. We have networks, arenas, fields. A lot of people interested in Bourdieu, interested in the notion of the field, constellations, ecologies, apparatuses for the Foucauldians, infrastructure is becoming very fashionable. These are all kind of aggregate relational kind of entities, which the moment we posit them some way, then we have problems of boundaries and what they are, and could something else be inside, and what the borders are. They're very, very problematic. You, the analyst, are creating them. You're writing, as Latour would say, the risky text to reveal these things. And of course, the ultimate relational entity is language itself. Language is a kind of net which we inhabit. And philosophers spend a lot of time thinking about that. My supervisor from Cambridge, who died recently, and her life was celebrated last week, and I attended. She was a constructivist, but of the kind of linguistic sense. But there are many ways of doing that, analyzing that net of language. So I think I'm looking at a paper which is influenced by Roland Barthes. That's one way of looking at it. There are many ways of doing that. But language as a net, classification systems as well, is a very kind of interesting and popular kind of relational entity that people are interesting. But you create, when you really are serious about relational entities, you also create methodological problems for yourselves. What are the boundaries? The relationships themselves are actually invisible to the participants in the field. So interviewing people, you have to be very, very skilled if you want to use interviews to reveal those relationship entities. But you are very active as an analyst in creating these entities and looking at them. And of course, traditional network analysis is one way of doing it. It's a little bit static, but if you look at a network at time t and then a network at t+1, you can kind of hypothesize some dynamics of change between the two. So that's in the camp of these relational entities. But there can be different levels of aggregation at which you look at the relational entity. You might think of studying something as small and episodic as what goes on in this room, or it might be a whole organization, or it might indeed be a field. Those are actually your choices to make, or choices which emerge as you look at the data and find interesting things. Then on actions and actors, do you, as individuals, naturally see, do you really think about human actors and their interests as substantially made rather than simply given, as being the product of life histories and biographical paths through the world which are highly contingent and form? And I think one of the hardest questions that we have to grapple with if you go down this route is, what is it to say that the self is constructed? How, for example, if we look at agency relationships, which is a kind of relational entity, how have those relationships been forged such that the human beings in those relationships think of themselves as in an agency relationship? So that kind of contingency. So what kind of actors, what kind of different actors populate your relational entities, and how do you give them priorities? So it's a really hard area with a huge amount of variation. So you have kind of the Foucauldian discipline self, which Miller and O'Leary wrote about, and in a sense, a lot of that work is about the creation of an actor as a kind of free, autonomous decision maker. That's not a kind of Cartesian given. It's not something that is just there. It's something that environments and relations construct. So some of the recent interesting work on ranking systems by Wendy Espeland show that it's not so much the construction of a subject and their identity and what goes on in their head as just the fact that people give more attention to some things rather than another. So performance systems like ranking systems shift attention and therefore change behavior and actions and shape the kind of agency that matters in the context of a particular setting. So this view, there are very many different views about actors and human selves as being dependent. I think the sociologist John Law has a very nice paper, I don't know the exact reference, where he's sitting in his office and he's describing all the relational networks that he sits in so that his own sense of autonomy as an autonomous individual is completely dependent on all of these relationships. His relation to his books and to students and the job and the university and so forth. And it's quite a nice device for unscrambling your notion of what selves are. But the kind of one of the key issues that often, because it's so difficult, gets ignored is what are the linkages between the actors? How do actors and actions and other things create linkages which are themselves the stuff of these relational entities? And in some ways, it's one sometimes chooses the path of least resistance. It's actually quite helpful to treat texts in organizational settings as kind of actors which do a lot of linking up of human actors. So following text can be a very, I think, good way, a very nice empirical way of beginning to build your net that you're interested in. And I think if you kind of do this, interesting things happen. Interesting things will come out of that kind of effort. And then thirdly, where it all pays off is the dynamics which links these actor points, these actions and actor points with these relational entities. And I guess the kind of questions here is, do you see things as kind of always changing in flux or as stable and fixed? Because so many people are writing about Bourdieu at the moment, I thought I would give myself a refresher course on the airplane yesterday. And I read a few things. And one of the things that really struck me is that Bourdieu, because of his own personal upbringing, just saw the world as a place of struggle. The world is what he called agonistic. It is constant struggle. And everything else in his work flows from that. Struggle over capital position, et cetera, et cetera. And it hadn't really occurred to me that if you just take the kind of theoretical categories, you don't quite get this very, very strong sense of struggle. And that informs all the dynamics he's interested in, whether it's the study of academic life or the Algerian conflict or anything like that. And I think you must ask yourself that question yourself, whether you actually really see things as a struggle. Personally, I've had a very comfortable, lucky life, and I've never really had to struggle. So I just don't see the world like that. So you really have to work at trying to kind of see the fact that you have to accept that Brexit is awful and we should go back to the way things were. No. Brexit is a function of a struggle that has been going on for decades, and it's a symptom of that. So it's a kind of a personal relationship that you have as individuals to what you think about dynamics. But more kind of in terms of your own research, then do you have a kind of clear event window within which you want to look at those dynamics, because I think that's a really good discipline, is to actually make what you're doing in a pragmatic way kind of manageable, and looking at the dynamic processes that might be in play in that window. And what kind of dynamism, just in a preliminary sense, do you think is going on? Is it the external shock dynamism? Or is it the kind of coincidental alignment of things which creates something, as we'll see in the value-added paper in a minute? Is it work by specific actors to stabilize things? Yeah, it could be a load of things. Fair value accounting. The dynamic of the emergence of fair value accounting, was it a shock? What was the prehistory? It would be reasonable to see that in those terms. Were there very specific mediators? Was it just something that Jim Leisenring was obsessed by? No, he had to have wider conditions of possibility that lined up in some ways, that the rise of finance as a discipline had to be in the cultural background in order for fair value accounting, which had been around for a long time, to have a kind of takeoff point. So I think these are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself. And so, yeah, what do we even mean by emergence, let alone emerging scholars, or submerged scholars in my case, but what does it mean? What is the language of emergence? Anthony Hopwood used to use the word emergence a lot in his papers. And actually, and it's wonderful, but it's also kind of a lazy term. So one of your challenges, if you were studying emergence, what would you actually be looking at? But the kind of headline point about dynamics is it's actually where these relations, these net-like aggregates that you're wrestling with, meet agencies. And in that meeting point, practices are formed, or practices are stabilized, or practices are destroyed. You yourselves, as academics, have to, in some sense, create that dynamic picture. You have to bring those two elements together in your research to see that dynamic is forging new practices or sustaining new ones. So a couple of examples. So a very famous one, and it's a paper that's worth rereading, is the Birch et al. Study of the rise of value-added accounting in 1985. And so, in a way, Hopwood and his colleagues, they had kind of three relational entities, or three entities they put into relationships with one another through their empirical work. Three arenas, and there were the arenas in the mid-70s in the UK, the arenas of industrial relations, the accounting standard setting arena, and the arena of discussions about economic productivity. And the notion of value-added accounting was a sort of programmatic idea formulated in part by the accounting standard setter, but also was in circulation by other bodies, was itself a way in which these different arenas found common ground, but also something which was enabled by the alignment of these different arenas. And that already is that endogenous picture of things is already a kind of scary kind of analytic construct. But it's an implicit co-emergence issue where both the object, value-added accounting, and the relationships to these arenas are happening at the same time and are mutually supportive. And then it all ends. It's temporary. It falls apart, and the political economy sort of shifts, if you like, to a more neoliberal phase. But for a brief time, value-added accounting lined up with the political culture and the kind of concern with economic productivity even though it was a very technically imperfect form of accounting. So I think, in my opinion, this is a very brilliant paper. It's also very flawed. It shows the kinds of challenges you face when you're trying to do this kind of constructivist work. It was very, very strong on relational entities, had a strong sense of relational entities, perhaps less strong on the agencies and the linkages between them, much more presumption in that sense. And the dynamics, although I put a tick there, I mean, in a way, it's actually rather a static analysis. The dynamics are less evident. So the real contribution of that paper is, and the surprise value of that paper was just the kind of bringing these relations, these external relations together to show that accounting doesn't just generate itself, it is positioned, it's positioned in a network of relations. The second example, and I apologize for this, is my own paper in AOS in 2015, which was written for a kind of celebration, 25-year celebration of AOS. And it looks at the emergence of impact as a kind of policy object in the UK higher education sector. And it's a kind of study of the kind of field level crystallization of that object, and then its specific implementation in the LSE, and the emergence of the impact case study as an accounting unit, as basically a new organizational accounting unit was born. So the title, How Accounting Begins, which David Cooper also didn't like, but it is a kind of new accounting system, and you don't get many chances to see brand new accounting systems kind of crystallize and come from nowhere. So I thought it was kind of interesting. But in the terms of that we're looking at, so at the center of it is the kind of the accretion of an infrastructure, sets of relations among actors which become more solid and more institutionalized around this object, and the reproduction of impact accounting and its normalization goes hand in hand with the building up, the accretion of this infrastructure. So the paper is actually quite weak on the relational entity side of things. I wasn't really sure if I was looking at the field as such or a particular organization. So it would be interesting to look at the impact constellation, that is to say, in government in general, people were beginning to talk a lot about impact, environmental impact, social welfare impact, and this notion may have spilled over into higher education. I didn't deal with that at all, but that's a possible kind of route. And the agencies in question I looked at tended to be more at the organizational level. And on the dynamics, people have said, well, it's just, it's far, far too linear. So you have a policy object of some kind. Universities have to account for their impact, and gradually that object becomes solidified and implemented in some ways and becomes something that people pay attention to. And what people have said to me is, but no, actually, once you create this kind of infrastructure, new objects, new surprising management objects and surprising side effects are also thrown off. And the whole thing can go in a new direction. So I say all of that to say just none of this is very easy. There are lots of trade-offs in research. You can't do it all in one paper, and I might mention some of the trade-offs when we have the editors panel, because very, very decent papers like the Birchall et al. In 1985, and some of our classic papers in our field are very flawed. They're very flawed by today's standards. But they were trying to do really new and exciting things in the way that Mats has talked about. And they were actually, what's interesting about them, they were trying to construct a sense of the positionality of accounting in these wider networks whatever they may be, and accountants as well. So what constructs what? Well, there's no general theory of that. It's an empirical question. And I think I would strongly advise reading Ian Hacking's Making Up People essay, not just because the idea of making up people is so brilliant in his rendering, but he does say there is no general theory of making up people. It will depend. In some cases, people are thoroughly made up by the classifications that apply to them, but in other cases, they're much more, have a much looser relationship to the way they're described. So it's not an entirely deterministic kind of view. So this meta view of constructivism I've kind of sort of tried to paint to you may give you a way actually of navigating the supermarket, because you have be able to say to yourself, well, let's look at thinker X, whoever that is. What relational entities do they have in play? What's their kind of view of agents and agencies in relation to those? What's the dynamic that relates them? And all of this before you actually try and figure out what they were worried about, what was the problem that they were dealing with. But I think that those two things go hand in hand. So it's a mindset. Being a good constructivist, in that sense of the title, is a kind of mindset of what you pay attention to. Pay attention to co-formation loops rather than, apparently singular causal paths. The linkage between people, practices, discourses, texts, things. What are those linkages? And paying attention to the specifics of the way people or what they attend to are constructed. I mean, I tend to shy away from notions of identity because I find them empirically too difficult to kind of think about and work with. I'm kind of not very interested in what goes on inside people's heads and that kind of thing. But what people do and how they spend their time and what they pay attention to does seem to be something that one can look at very carefully. And the analysis is, the constructivist analysis is a way of making visible how practices subsist in this kind of web of relations. There's a very kind of interesting work being done on valuation at the moment. I think there'll be a special issue in AOS on valuation work to show that valuation isn't a person doing valuation according to some specific algorithm or rule or something, but is a very kind of carefully constructed set of codependencies between different agencies, which all slightly rely on each other. I mean, I sit on the board of a financial services company, and I sit on the valuation committee for sort of private equity investments, and these are entirely constructed from different reference points and agencies. These are pure constructs, and only when things fall apart in some way do you suddenly realize how dependent they were on those constructs. There's also, I should say, a kind of a symposium which will be published in AOS, which I edited, Accounting and Actorhood, which deals with some of the issues I've just touched on, and there's a paper and then there's a couple of commentaries which deals with the whole notion that, in a sense, actors are constructed, but not only that, the idea of actorhood is some kind of modern rationalistic device which is imposed on various organizational settings. So finally, I think critique, the big one. And this was being discussed when I went to my first interdisciplinary perspectives in accounting conference in 1985, and I was working for Deloitte Haskins and Sells as an auditor, auditing a car leasing firm. and looking at how they dealt with warranties, so quite specific. And then I plunged into the world of critical accounting, where this debate was going on then. It's an unended debate, and I think probably the sort of tensions it engenders are good ones. There is a kind of view that what I've described to you, the constructivist point of view I've described to you, is bad, it's conservative, because it's essentially descriptive. What you're doing is you're kind of unearthing relations which are out there. But I don't necessarily see that. I think there is, in Matt's sense, a more reflexive relationship between kind of three levels of analysis. And I shared this with Yves in an email not so long ago, and he didn't think it was stupid. So I'm sharing it with you. So there's what we've been talking about. You, the analyst, whatever it is you choose to do, and however you wish to be interesting, a kind of constructivist understanding of how things are the way they are. Perhaps the way they change, but how things are held together. But then I think you can adopt a kind of more sort of policy perspective or a normative view about whether that state of affairs is itself desirable, and therefore what further mechanisms might be needed to bring about desired changes. I mean, I don't do much of that kind of work, but what I do worried about is a sort of purely normative approach which lacks the analytical. Then I think that is, in my view, a kind of weakness. But I think just plugging AOS, I think we would be very open to policy papers, very, very strong analytical grounding, but they're quite hard to write. And then the sort of third level is more what I would say is the critical, reflexive level, is kind of looking at those two things and seeking to position them as Bourdieu and Marx did, seeking to position them in a wider sense of political economy, and particularly the study of how power actually operates and works. And just on Marx, I mean, Marx was a very good analyst, a constructivist analyst. I mean, if you want to know how capitalism works, I mean, you know, that's the person to go to and read. But that, for him, was a means to an end. And I think that's the relationship to critique. Anyway, that's a bit simplistic, but I'll kind of leave it at that. Now, I've got a couple of remarks on writing, which I'm going to be 5 minutes on that. It's a slight change of direction, maybe closer to a kind of editorial panel, but you want to publish, but you also want to be read. It's actually nice if people read your work. And I think one of the problems we face in our world, we're all guilty of it, is the citation clutter. So many papers I read which cite the same paper so many times in so many different places in the paper. We're in a citation clutter world. It's not just that Elsevier has reduced the font size to 0.8 or something ridiculous, so I can't actually read the journal anymore because it's too small. But it's also, they're very hard to read string citations. So, the verb is there, and then there's a load of citations, and then maybe the object is several sentences away. So I think we've actually got a bit of an issue about how far we've gone with citations, and it's something I kind of would like people to think about. I won't go into templates, but I'll just share with you a couple of sort of issues with papers that I find. Introductions are often confusing. I think people write introductions to papers after the paper, but they often have too many objectives in them. And sometimes the objectives are restated later on, and they're different from the original objectives. So I think work hard on having a great introduction. I always think if you can write a good introduction, you can probably write the rest of the paper very clearly. There's a problem of weak objectives. I'm going to explore X, or I'm going to analyze Y. Well, so what? I mean, coming back to to Matt's point, I'm exploring Y because there's a conventional view that, I'm exploring X because there's a conventional view that X is the way it is because of Z, but I'm going to show something different or challenge that. So, I mean, the problem is a lot of us start research by exploring. We're hunting for things to find, but I think mere exploration, I'm always inclined to say so what. The next point I'll just pick up on is literature reviews are often very mechanical, and it's much nicer to use a literature review as a thematic and setup. So for those of you in your doctoral work, the literature chapter, it can be a kind of dead chapter, or it can be something that is the platform for everything that you want to say later on in the work. Not easy to do. A synthetic literature review is a real skill. We don't have time to go into how you might do that. And then exactly as Mats has said, the sort of theory versus theory building, what is evolving. I think everyone in this room, you should all really feel confident that your engagement with your particular case setting or empirical data, there must be opportunities to build theory, to show that Bourdieu's notion of habitus is perhaps kind of not quite as tractable as it might seem, and so on and so on. I think there are these opportunities. I think you see them. I just think it's a confidence issue. And my last favorite is the paragraph audit. So you have to have some auditing in here. So as an editor and a reviewer, I've sort of become a little bit obsessed about how papers are put together and read. So I checked a few of my own, and there are about 50 to 60 paragraphs in a normal paper, 50 to 60 paragraphs. And then I mapped the sequence, the logical sequence of the paragraphs. And it was quite a shock as to how poor that logical sequence often is. Things ending in the middle or definitely in the wrong sequence. One colleague came to me once and said, your papers are very nice, but you've always got the main thought in the middle of the paragraph. Why don't you put it at the front? So we all have these habits. And so I kind of suggest to you, again, don't have time to give you a practical example, but what work does each paragraph that you write, what work does that do within the whole? Do you have a way of mapping? Now, in the 19th century, when they wrote books, they would write a kind of synoptic contents page, which would be like what all the paragraphs said. And so the contents page for 19th century books goes on and on and on. But it's actually a rather good discipline because you can see the logical flow of thought. So can you, your challenge, go away and whatever chapter or paper you're working on, just take a little time on one side of paper to map the paragraphs and all their relationships to each other, and then ask yourself, am I happy with that? Does that actually work? Is that a sequence that works as a detective story or in another kind of way? And I think it will help readability enormously. So anyway, just a summary. Constructivism is hard. It's very confusing. There's a lot of things out there. So I've tried to give you a sense of what I think are the essential entry points into thinking like a constructivist. I really strongly recommend trying to write things in your own words, particularly if you read an article. Just try and write half a page. Put the article away. I know you've highlighted everything and you want to quote everything. Put the article away and just try and rewrite what you think the author was trying to say in your own words. And it's going to help the way you read and draw upon theory so that the stepladder approach will just become more natural or non-natural to you. There are many constructivisms, many different schools of thought, a lot of variety. But I think they all have in common this kind of attention to relationality, agenthood as a kind of problem, if you like, rather than a starting point, and an attention to dynamics and events. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. On time.
There is no time left, but perhaps we could answer one question before we go to our breakout sessions. One question, maybe, a quick one.
Hi, I'm Daniela from Monash University in Melbourne. I just wanted to know, with the cluttering of citations, how does that emerge? Is it a requirement for the journals, or I noticed that as well when I'm reading. I sometimes don't know where the sentence actually starts or what it's about. I've forgotten by the time I've gotten to the citation.
It's a really good question. I actually don't know how it's happened. I think it's crept up on us. Of course, citation counts are important, seem to be important to people. I mean, others, I don't know. I mean, others in the room would have a view of when it sort of changed. Because actually, if you look at papers in the 80s, there are citations, but not the kind of density that we see today. So I actually don't know. I think it's sort of crept up. Sorry, it's not a great answer. Sorry?
How do we push it back?
I think you can do it. I mean, you can footnote more, but ask yourself, how many times do you have to actually cite Power the Audit Society in a paper? How many times do you really need to do that? Once, if it's either naught or one.